The Freeman case begins with smoke over a quiet road near Welsh, Oklahoma, and tonight we sit beside the old file as if the paper itself still holds the cool of that winter morning. There is no rush here, and you can let the pace settle as slowly as dust on a desk lamp. You can imagine the first page beneath your hands, slightly soft at the corners, smelling faintly of storage cardboard and old ink, with the date written plainly enough to stop a person for a moment, the 30th of December, 1999. In the Freeman case, that morning came just after Christmas, when the decorations of small houses still glowed in windows, and the air outside carried the hard, quiet chill of northeastern Oklahoma before dawn. You turn the page gently, because this is not a story to hurry. Welch was a small place, spread low across the land, where gravel roads held the marks of tires for a while after rain, and where people knew the color of one another's trucks, to part of a familiar rural landscape where the wind moved across fields and the nights could feel very large. By the time the first calls came in, the house was burning. You can picture the orange light on the damp ground, the soft hiss of water from hoses, and the heavy smell of smoke clinging to coats and hair. Firefighters worked through the remains, doing what firefighters do, with tired hands, cold faces, and the steady concentration of people trained to look closely at difficult things. Inside the home, they found Kathy Freeman. Her husband, Danny Freeman, was not found at first, and neither were the two girls who should have been there that night, Ashley Freeman and her close friend, Loria Bible. Ashley had just turned 16 on the 29th of December, and Loria had come over to spend the night, the sort of ordinary plan that belongs to school friends, pizza, birthdays, and the last sleepy days of the year. As you sit with that first section of the file, you notice how quickly an investigation can become a room full of absences. There was the absence of Ashley. There was the absence of Loria. There was the absence of Loria. There was the absence, at first, of Danny Freeman, and in those early hours, absence could be mistaken for direction, because detectives often have to begin with what is missing before they understand what is present. You can almost hear the low voices near the scene, the radios clicking, the wet crunch of boots over ash and frozen ground. Someone would have been taking notes. Someone would have been trying to keep onlookers back. Someone would have been looking at the burned shell of the home and asking the first careful questions, the kind that do not yet know whether they are the right questions. In the beginning, the case seemed to lean toward Danny Freeman, simply because he could not be found. It was an early theory, the kind investigators sometimes form when the known facts are still few, and the light is still poor. You can feel the uncomfortable weight of that page, because later pages would change the shape of the morning, and yet the first impression had already begun to move through town. The Freeman family had known grief before that winter. Ashley's brother, Shane, had died the year before, after an encounter with law enforcement, and Danny and Kathy had carried that loss in public and private ways. There had been anger. There had been talk of legal action. There were feelings in the community that did not fit neatly into a report. And as you read, you can sense how old pain can make a fresh investigation more complicated. Still, the file asks you to stay patient. It asks you to hold each piece separately. A family history is not proof of anything. A rumor is not a map. A feeling in town, even when many people share it, is still only a feeling until it becomes something that can be checked, written down, compared, and tested against the quiet facts. The next day, the 31st of December, Loria Bible's parents returned to the scene. You can imagine them moving through the cold remains of that place with a grief that had not yet found its shape, looking for anything that might have been missed. They were not trained scene investigators, but they were parents, and sometimes a parent looks with a kind of focus no procedure can fully describe. There, in what remained of the Freeman home, they found what investigators had missed. Danny Freeman was still inside. The file shifts under your hand at that point, because one assumption falls away, and another question takes its place. If Danny had not left, and Kathy had not survived, then where were Ashley and Loria? You turn back in the file, perhaps more slowly now. The pages do not raise their voices. They simply make you look again. 2 adults were dead in the home. 2 teenage girls were gone. The fire had damaged almost everything, and the scene that might have spoken clearly had been changed by heat, smoke, water, weather, and the passage of many confused hours. For an investigator, this is where patience begins to matter most. You are not only looking for evidence, you are also looking for the places where evidence may have been lost. You study photographs that show warped metal, darkened boards, and the pale grey scatter of ash, and you try to imagine what the room had been before the fire took away its ordinary shape. The air in those photographs seems cold even now. You can almost feel the stiffness of the evidence gloves, the dampness at the knees of a pair of work pants, the way smoke settles into paper after it has been carried back to an office. A case file is not just words. It holds the weather of the day if you sit with it long enough. Ashley Freeman's car was still there. Loria Bible's belongings, as the accounts have long described, did not suggest a planned leaving. These are small details, but cold cases often live by small details because the large answers stay out of reach. You learn to respect the ordinary things. A purse, a coat, a set of keys, a bedroom item left behind because someone expected to come back to it. In the Freeman case, the absence of the girls became the center of everything. You can feel investigators trying to understand whether Ashley and Loria had fled the fire, whether someone had taken them, whether they had been removed before the flames were seen, or whether the fire itself had hidden something. Each possibility had to be considered, and each one had its own long hallway of questions. The tools available in 1999 were not the tools you might imagine now. There were no simple digital trails waiting in every pocket. No one was checking a modern phone location map, refreshing a dashboard, or pulling neighborhood camera footage from doorbells. You had statements, search parties, photographs, lab work, phone calls, handwritten notes, and the slow human work of asking again. You can sit beside the investigators in that older world, where a ringing phone mattered more than a notification, and where tips arrived as voices, letters, and rumors repeated over counters. A detective might drink coffee gone lukewarm in a paper cup while listening to someone describe a truck they thought they saw, or a man they thought had spoken too freely, or a memory that had changed shape over time. Some tips would have seemed promising at first. Some would have faded after a few calls. Some would have stayed in the file because no one could fully prove or disprove them. In a case like this, you learn that information does not arrive cleanly, and the work is often less like solving a puzzle than sorting a drawer in low light. You pick up another page, and it has the feeling of a statement taken in a small office, perhaps under fluorescent lights that hum softly overhead. The witness tries to remember. The investigator tries not to lead. The pen moves, pauses, moves again. Outside the room, life continues in its ordinary way, with vending machines, ringing phones, and the winter scrape of shoes in a hallway. For the families, the waiting was not procedural. It was daily. You can imagine Loria's parents measuring time by missed meals, missed birthdays, missed school days, and the terrible quiet of a room that still held her things. You can imagine Ashley's relatives living with a house gone, parents gone, and a young girl gone into questions that no one could answer. That is one of the softest and heaviest truths in the file. Investigators may close a folder at the end of a workday, though many never really leave it behind. Families cannot close the day so neatly. The case follows them into grocery aisles, church pews, kitchen tables, and the thin hours before dawn, when every sound in a house seems too clear. The first searches spread through the land around Welch. You can picture fields under a pale winter sky, the brittle sound of brush under boots, the smell of wet leaves and cold soil. Volunteers would have moved carefully, hoping to find something and hoping not to find the wrong thing. That is the strange mercy and fear of a search, held together in the same breath. You are the detective tonight, reading the search notes with the patience they require. A location is checked, a pond is considered, a road is driven again, a person remembers an outbuilding, a mine opening, a rural property, a place where someone once dumped trash. Each line is plain, but each line represents hours of bodies moving through weather. The area itself made the investigation difficult. Northeastern Oklahoma is crossed by backroads, fields, creeks, old mining country, and small communities where a person can be known and still keep secrets. Nearer to picture, the old lead and zinc mining landscape held shafts, pits, unstable ground, and places where the earth had been disturbed long before any detective arrived with a notebook. When you read that, you can feel how geography becomes part of the case. The map is not just a map, it is distance, mud, property lines, locked gates, abandoned structures, and the smell of minerals in old ground. It is also memory, because people remember roads by who lived there, what used to stand there, and which turn you take after the broken fence. As months passed, the Freeman case settled into the difficult rhythm of a missing person investigation tied to a double homicide. There were bursts of activity, then long quiet stretches. A tip would come in and open a door for a few days. Then the door would narrow again, and the file would return to the shelf. Not forgotten, but waiting. You can imagine the shelf. It might be metal, painted a dull government grey, with boxes lined up in uneven rows. The Freeman Bible file would not have been light. It would have held photographs, reports, transcripts, lab requests, maps, and scraps of information that seemed too small to discard. When you lift a file like that, you feel it's years before you read them. One early difficulty was the noise around the case. In a small town, stories move quickly. They move in diners, gas stations, living rooms, and parking lots after dark. Some stories contain truth. Some contain fear. Some contain anger dressed as certainty. As you read, you learn to listen gently, but you also learn not to let every voice steer the road. There were rumors about the Freemans. There were rumors about law enforcement. There were rumors about drugs, money, old grudges, and dangerous people in the area. The investigator's task was not to pretend rumors did not matter. It was to test them without being carried away by them, like keeping a hand steady over a candle flame. You can almost feel the paper trail thickening as the years begin to pass. A detective writes a name. Another detective, years later, underlines it. A witness says one thing in one season, then remembers another detail after a documentary airs or after a neighbor dies. The work becomes layered, and each layer has to be handled without tearing the one beneath it. The names Ashley Freeman and Loria Bible stayed at the center. That matters. In a case with many rumors, many suspects, and many theories, the girls themselves could not become footnotes. You return to their names often, because that is how the file keeps its moral center. Ashley and Loria were not symbols. They were teenagers with families, habits, voices, and ordinary plans. You can imagine a photograph of them lying flat on a desk. The surface is slightly glossy under the lamp. Maybe the edges have been touched too many times. The image does what photographs do in cold cases. It stops time at the edge of a life, and it asks everyone who sees it to remember that the missing person was once simply present. Investigators followed many possible paths in the years that followed. Some paths led to convicted men who claimed knowledge, then changed their stories. Some led to searches that produced nothing useful. Some led to people who may have wanted attention, comfort, leverage, or a better situation for themselves. You read those pages carefully because false statements can still consume real years. One of those men was Tommy Lynn Sells, whose name appeared in connection with many investigations. Another was Jeremy Jones, who also offered claims about Ashley and Loria. In both instances, the work required checking the words against places, records, possibilities, and the stubborn plainness of evidence. A confession is not a conclusion simply because it sounds complete. You sit with that lesson for a moment. In detective work, a story that explains everything can be dangerous if it is not true. It can soothe the mind too quickly. It can make people stop looking. So the patient investigator listens, writes, checks, and returns to the beginning, asking whether the statement fits the known facts or merely covers them like a blanket. The searches connected to those claims brought investigators into difficult landscapes. You can picture old mine areas, quiet and uneven, with weeds moving in the wind and warning signs faded by weather. Searchers would have carried equipment, lights, ropes, maps, and the hope that some specific place might finally answer what paper could not. Yet those searches did not bring Ashley and Loria home. The file kept its silence. The families kept waiting. The investigators kept returning to witness statements, old notes, and names that had never fully gone away. That is how cold cases often live, not in one grand discovery, but in repeated attention over a long span of ordinary days. As you turn another page, the texture of the case changes. The paper becomes less about the first morning and more about the long after. Years pass in the margins. Detectives retire. Sheriffs change. Evidence rooms are reorganized. Boxes move from one shelf to another. The case remains, and each person who touches it leaves a small trace of care or confusion. This is where you begin to understand the patient side of the Freeman case. It was not only a matter of finding one missing clue, it was a matter of preserving enough of the past that someone in the future could still ask useful questions. A report misfiled or a note overlooked can matter years later when a new investigator reads it with a different light. You can feel the quiet of a cold case unit if you let yourself sit there. The room is not dramatic. It has printers, cabinets, chairs that squeak, and windows that reflect the inside after dark. Someone opens a box. Someone smooths a photocopy. Someone writes a name on a legal pad and draws a line to another name. Not with excitement, but with care. In the Freeman Bible investigation, care often meant returning to people who had already spoken. A witness might have been afraid before. A witness might have been young, dependent, confused, or surrounded by people they did not trust. Time can close mouths, but it can also open them, especially after suspects die, relationships end, or the weight of keeping quiet becomes too much. That is one of the sad, human truths in a file like this. People do not always tell what they know when knowledge first matters. Sometimes they wait because they are afraid. Sometimes they wait because they doubt themselves. Sometimes they wait because the people around them have power, in small, private ways. A detective has to understand that without excusing the damage done by silence. Years later, the names Ronnie Busick, Warren Philip Welch, and David Pennington would become central to the case. You do not need to hurry toward them. In the file, they arrive the way old names often do, first as talk, then as statements, then as connections that require patient checking. You sit with the pages and let the pattern form slowly. Welch, often called Phil, had been spoken of for years in relation to disturbing rumors about the girls. Pennington's name moved through those same circles. Busick, too, was described as part of that world. The allegations connected to them were grave, but an investigator cannot build a case from gravity alone. You need witnesses, corroboration, documents, timelines, and the small fixed points that allow a larger picture to hold. You can imagine how frustrating that would be. A family may hear a name whispered for years. A town may repeat a story until it sounds almost solid. But in court, and in an honest investigation, something more is needed. The file must become sturdy enough to stand outside rumor. It must carry dates, places, identities, and statements that can survive careful questioning. There were reports of photographs too, Polaroids said to have shown Ashley and Loria after they disappeared. The photographs themselves were not recovered, and because of that, they became a painful kind of shadow evidence. People described them, families heard of them, investigators had to treat the accounts seriously, while also facing the ache of not having the objects in hand. You can picture a detective writing the word Polaroid in a report, the pen pressing a little harder than usual. It is such a physical word, tied to a square photograph, a white border, an image slowly appearing in someone's hand. In a cold case file, an unrecovered photograph is both a lead and an absence, and you learn to hold both at once. The families knew about those accounts for years. That is important to say gently. Public attention sometimes treats old information as a sudden revelation, but families often live with details long before the wider world hears them. You, as the listener and the quiet detective tonight, have to remember that what feels new on a page may have been old pain at someone else's kitchen table. The case waited through the 2000s. It waited through anniversaries, television segments, searches, tips, and the changing sound of the world around it. Phones changed. Databases improved, people moved away, some people died, some records stayed where they were, holding their thin black print in folders that smelled of toner and dust. Then, years later, something shifted in the file, not loudly, but with the soft scrape of an old box being opened again. That shift came through the kind of work that rarely feels dramatic while it is happening. The rereading of statements, the recontacting of old witnesses, and the careful listening for places where one account brushed against another. You can imagine the room where it happened, with a file box open on a table, the paper edges uneven, a cup leaving a faint ring beside a legal pad. Someone had to sit there and give the Freeman case time again, not because time heals a file, but because time sometimes changes what people are willing to say. You notice how the language in the later reports begins to sound different. It is still measured, it is still official, but underneath the formal words, you can feel movement. Names that had once floated through rumor begin to settle into clearer positions, and the long-known names of Ashley Freeman and Loria Bible remain at the center, steady as a small lamp in an otherwise dim room. We keep returning to them because every witness statement, every search, and every carefully worded charge ultimately circles back to two girls who never came home. The investigation had to pass through grief, distrust, and years of community talk before it reached that later stage. You can feel how hard that would be for detectives stepping into an old case, because every person they interviewed had already lived with the story for a long time. Some witnesses had told versions before, some had held pieces back, some had heard so many second-hand accounts that memory and rumor had softened together, like papers left too long in a damp drawer. Still, the work continued. You sit beside that work now, and you can almost hear the soft click of a recorder starting, the creak of a chair as someone shifts, and the low murmur of a question being asked carefully. The detective does not rush the witness. The witness does not always answer directly. Between them lies the case, patient and heavy, waiting for words that might still hold something useful after so many years. One of the painful themes in the Freeman case was that the right names may have been near the investigation for a long time. That does not mean the answers were easy. A name is not evidence by itself. A name can be spoken in anger, fear, guilt, or confusion. You learn, reading slowly, that an old name in a file must still be lifted with both hands, checked for weight, and set beside everything else. By the 2010s, the case had become part of Oklahoma's long memory. Ashley and Loria's photographs had appeared in news stories, missing person posters, and anniversary features, their faces holding the same teenage age while the world around them grew older. You can picture those photographs on a corkboard, pinned slightly crooked, the corners curling from room air. For families, that stillness is not symbolic. It is daily. The missing remain the same age in public, while everyone who loves them keeps changing. The renewed investigation brought attention back to statements involving Ronnie Busick, Warren Philip Welch, and David Pennington. Welch and Pennington were no longer alive by the time charges came, which gave the case a particular quiet difficulty. You cannot ask a dead man a follow-up question. You cannot test his expression against a detail. You cannot let a jury watch him answer. What remains has to be built from living witnesses, old accounts, and the hard limits of time. As you turn those pages, you can feel the investigative patience required by that limit. The file is not only asking what happened in 1999, it is asking what can still be proven after witnesses have aged, records have moved, and suspects have died. That is a different kind of labor, slower and more fragile, like trying to read pencil marks under yellowed tape without tearing the paper beneath. In April of 2018, Ronnie Busick was arrested. You do not need to say that sentence loudly for it to matter. After nearly 18.5 years, the case that had seemed to sit in long silence moved into a courtroom path, where the language changed again, from tips and leads to charges, hearings, and sworn proceedings. The Freeman case had not become simple, but it had entered a new room. You can picture that new room with its polished benches, its quiet air, its papers stacked in folders rather than evidence boxes. A courtroom has a different smell from an archive. Less dust and more floor wax. Less old paper and more pressed fabric. Families sit upright because there is nowhere comfortable to place grief in public. Reporters watch for names. Attorneys speak in careful phrases, and every word seems to arrive with a little more weight. The charges against Busick were tied to the deaths of Danny and Kathy Freeman and the disappearance of Ashley Freeman and Loria Bible. The public record around the case described allegations that the girls had been taken after the Freemans were killed, and that the men involved had kept them for a time afterward. We do not need to dwell in those details. For this quiet file, it is enough to know that the allegations were serious, painful, and approached through the legal language available after so many years. You may notice, as you sit with this portion, how much restraint the file requires. There are details that can be stated, and there are details that do not need to be lingered over. A sleep story about patient investigation can still tell the truth without turning pain into spectacle. So we keep our eyes on the work, the statements gathered, the suspects named, the searches organized, and the long effort to bring something solid into the light. For Loria Bible's family, especially her mother, Lorraine, the work had never really stopped. You can imagine what that kind of persistence feels like from the outside, but only partly. It is phone calls made when others have gone quiet. It is binders kept close. It is repeating your child's name to people who were not there in the beginning, because every new person needs to understand that this is not an old story to you. You can sit for a moment with the sound of a home printer working late at night, the dry slide of paper into a folder, the soft tap of a finger on a map. Families in cold cases often become archivists without choosing to be. They save clippings. They remember names. They notice when a date is wrong. They keep photographs where the face can still be seen clearly, because clarity itself becomes a form of devotion. That devotion shaped the Freeman case in ways no official report can fully hold. Detectives may carry a case for years, but families carry the person. They carry the favorite foods, the laugh, the small habits, the birthday plans, the clothes left behind, and the ordinary tones of a voice that no transcript can preserve. You feel that difference when the file mentions Ashley and Loria as missing persons, because the words are true, but they are thin beside the lives they point toward. Busick's arrest did not end the waiting, it changed the shape of it. A case can move forward legally while still leaving the central ache untouched. Where were Ashley and Loria? Could they be found? Would anyone say where they were? You turn that question in your hands like a smooth stone, and you understand why every plea, every hearing, and every interview seemed to circle back to location. Searches continued after the arrest. Investigators looked again at places connected to old statements, old rumors, and newer information. You can picture teams moving through wooded patches, open ground, and the damaged landscapes around old mining areas, the air smelling of grass, rust, and wet earth. Search work has a sound of its own. Quiet instructions, distant engines, the brush of clothing against branches, the small scrape of a boot against stone. Sometimes the searchers used machines, sometimes they used maps and memory, pairing what a witness said with what the land allowed. You can feel the difficulty in that pairing. A person might describe a place from years earlier, before a road changed, before a building fell, before trees grew higher. Time does not only pass through people, it passes through landscapes too. As you read, you notice how often patience becomes physical. It is not only a virtue or a mood, it is walking another grid line. It is lowering equipment into another opening. It is checking another rural property with permission and caution. It is standing in heat, cold, or mud, because a sentence in an interview pointed toward that ground, and because the missing deserve the effort, even when the odds are small. The old mining country near Pitcher and surrounding areas added a particular challenge. The ground there held the history of extraction, abandonment, and environmental damage, with chat piles, sinkholes, and unstable places that could be dangerous to search. You can imagine the pale dust on boots, the strange openness of a place shaped by industry and neglect, and the way a search team would have to move carefully, respecting both the case and the hazards beneath them. That landscape had its own silence, not an empty silence, exactly, but a layered one, filled with wind over gravel, the distant call of a bird, and the faint metallic smell that old industrial ground can keep after everyone has left. When you place the Freeman case against that land, you understand why an answer could seem close in one moment and impossibly far in the next. There were so many places to look, and each place asked for time. In 2020, Busick entered a plea connected to the case. He did not become the man who gave the families the full answer they had waited for. The court process brought an official measure of responsibility, but the deeper question remained painfully open. You can feel how complicated that is. A legal result on paper, a sentence pronounced in a courtroom, and still no recovery of Ashley and Loria. The words spoken in court had to fit within law. The words held by the families had to fit within loss. Those are not the same container. You can picture the official paper sliding into the court file, crisp and signed, while outside the courthouse, the sky looks ordinary, and cars pass as if nothing ancient has just shifted. That is one of the strange things about court days. They can be enormous for one family and barely visible to the world around them. You return to the investigative file, because that is where the unanswered part still lives. A plea can say some things. It cannot create a map where no map exists. It cannot restore the first scene. It cannot bring back the lost years. So the detectives, the families, and the people who cared about the case kept facing the same quiet absence, asking where Ashley and Loria had been taken and whether they could still be found. There are cases where an arrest feels like a door closing. The Freeman case was not quite like that. It felt more like a door opening onto another long hallway, dim but not empty. You can see why investigators would keep working, because a person can be held accountable in one sense, while the search continues in another. Justice and recovery can overlap, but they do not always arrive together. When we sit with that distinction, the case becomes less like a mystery designed for neatness and more like real life, where partial answers often have to be carried carefully. You may know who was charged, you may know what a court accepted, you may know what witnesses said, but if the missing are still missing, the file keeps breathing in a quiet way, and the work does not feel finished. The human mind wants a final page. You can feel that want in yourself as you read. It wants a place, a date, a confession that matches the land, a recovery, a service, a grave, a sentence that lets everyone exhale. But cold cases teach a different discipline. They teach you to hold unfinished knowledge without forcing it to become complete before it is ready. That discipline was visible in the way investigators and families responded over time. They did not stop asking for information. They did not stop returning to the area. They did not stop saying the names Ashley Freeman and Loria Bible. You can hear those names almost like a steady refrain in the file. Not dramatic, not loud, but present. A name repeated with care can keep a person from disappearing into paperwork. The case also asks us to think about how communities remember. Welch, Oklahoma, did not remain frozen in 1999, though part of its public memory stayed there. People aged, children became adults, roads changed, businesses opened and closed, yet the story remained in the background, like a room in a house that no one uses often but everyone knows is there. You can imagine a person who was young when the fire happened, growing older with the case as part of local weather. They hear adults talk in lowered voices. They see the girls' pictures on television. They learn the names before they understand the full weight of them. Years later, that person may become a witness to memory itself, carrying fragments of what the town felt like when everyone was still waiting for the first clear answer. For detectives, community memory can be both help and haze. Someone might remember a truck near a road because it truly stood out. Someone else might remember it because they heard the story so many times that the image settled into their mind. You, reading the file, have to move gently through that haze, not dismissing people, but not surrendering to every remembered shape. This is where careful documentation matters. A good report fixes a statement in time. It tells you what was said before later stories had a chance to influence it. The paper may feel dry under your fingers, but its dryness is part of its value. It does not try to persuade you with emotion. It simply says, on this date, this person said these words, and now you may compare them with the rest. You might pause over a transcript where the answers are uneven. A witness remembers a place, but not a date. Another remembers a name, but not whether the name was heard directly or through someone else. The detective asks again, quietly. The room may be too warm. The recorder may sit between them like a small black box of patience. In cold case work, Uncertainty is not an enemy. It is a material you must handle honestly. That honesty becomes especially important when a case has received public attention. Television programs, articles, and internet discussions can keep a case alive, which matters. They can also add layers of speculation that investigators must separate from evidence. You can feel the file growing heavier under that pressure, as if each public retelling leaves a faint fingerprint on the glass. The Freeman case drew that kind of attention because it carried so many elements that people struggled to reconcile. A fire, 2 adults dead, 2 girls missing, earlier conflict with law enforcement, rumors of local men, and years without recovery. It is natural that people tried to make sense of it. It is also necessary, as the quiet detective tonight, to let sense come slowly and only where the evidence permits. In the old file, the early handling of the scene remains one of the hardest sections to read. The fact that Danny Freeman was not found until the next day has lingered over the investigation for years. You do not need to scold the page loudly to understand the cost. A missed discovery at a scene can shape public trust, alter early theories, and leave families wondering what else might have been overlooked. You can imagine the scene after the fire crews left, the blackened structure cooling under a pale sky, the air still sharp with smoke and wet ash. To walk through such a place requires training, but also stamina. Everything is altered. Furniture becomes shape. Rooms become fragments. The ordinary clues of a household are turned into debris, and the investigator must find order without pretending the disorder is less than it is. When Lauria's parents found Danny Freeman, the case changed in a deeply public way. It showed that grief-stricken parents had seen what officials had missed. That fact could not help but affect trust. You can feel the ache of it as you read, because trust is not a small thing in a missing person case. Families have to believe that every hour is being used with care, and when they cannot, they begin to carry more themselves. That is another reason the later persistence of the families matters. They were not simply waiting beside the road. They were pushing, asking, remembering, correcting, and keeping the case in public view. You can hear the exhaustion in that kind of work, even if the file cannot record it. The voice on the phone stays polite, the hand holding the paper stays steady, but the years gather behind every question. For an investigator returning years later, that family knowledge can be invaluable. It can also be painful to receive. You might sit at a kitchen table with a parent who has memorized more names than you have yet read, and you know you are entering a story that has already cost them too much. The table may smell faintly of coffee. There may be photographs nearby. Your notebook is new, but their waiting is not. In that room, you would need humility. A cold case detective cannot arrive as if the case began when they opened the file. You would listen first. You would let the family tell you which roads had been searched, which rumors had been checked, which promises had been made, and which disappointments still sting. Only then could you begin to add your own work to the long work already done. The Freeman case is a study in that kind of humility. It asks investigators to acknowledge early mistakes without becoming trapped by them. It asks families to keep engaging with systems that may have failed them. It asks witnesses to face old fear. And it asks the rest of us, sitting quietly with the story, to resist the easy comfort of certainty when certainty has not been earned. As the later investigation focused more clearly on Busick, Welch, and Pennington, the story became less about one unknown shadow and more about a circle of people, places, and statements. You can imagine detectives drawing timelines on large sheets of paper, using different colors for different accounts, then stepping back to see where the lines crossed. There is a soft rustle when paper that large is moved. There is a tired satisfaction when one date finally aligns. Those alignments matter because old cases often turn on corroboration. One person says a thing, another person, interviewed separately, places a suspect nearby. A third remembers a vehicle, a conversation, a location, or a fear. None of it may be enough alone. Together, if handled carefully, it can become a structure. You build slowly, because a structure made too quickly can collapse under questioning. The witness accounts associated with the later case described troubling claims about what happened after the fire. Some accounts suggested that people had seen or heard things involving Ashley and Lauria, after the night they disappeared. You do not need to linger on the distress of those claims to understand their importance. If true, they meant the girls had survived the first night, and that the search for them had been misdirected in its earliest hours. You sit with that possibility in a quiet way, because it is one of the hardest kinds of knowledge a family can carry. The thought that there may have been time, the thought that someone may have known, the thought that silence may have stood between the girls and help. A detective cannot let such thoughts become haste, but no compassionate person can pretend they are weightless. The file returns again and again to the question of who knew what and when. Those are simple words, but they open wide rooms. A person may have known directly. A person may have suspected. A person may have heard a story told by someone drunk, frightened, proud, or careless. A person may have misunderstood. You and I sit with those distinctions because they are the difference between rumor and testimony. In a sleepy room, under a small lamp, you can almost see the index cards. One name per card, one location per card, one statement clipped behind another. The work has a tactile calm to it, even when the subject is painful. Paper slides. A pencil taps once. A detective leans back and looks at the wall, not for drama, but because the mind sometimes needs space to let a pattern appear. The pattern that eventually supported charges came too late to question Welch and Pennington in court. Both had died before the legal case reached that stage. Their absence shaped what prosecutors could do and what families could expect. You can feel how time, once again, acted like both witness and thief. It preserved some memories. It took away some voices. It left Busick as the living defendant tied to an old and battered case. Busick himself became a figure through whom many people hoped for answers, not simply punishment, answers. Where were Ashley and Loria? What had happened after the fire? Who else had known? You can imagine investigators pressing those questions in interview rooms, with plain walls and a table scratched by years of use. The air might smell of old carpet and coffee, and the clock would make its small, steady sound. But people do not always give the answer most needed. Sometimes they give fragments. Sometimes they give self-serving versions. Sometimes they deny, minimize, or place responsibility on those no longer alive. You read with caution. A defendant's words must be weighed against evidence, witness accounts, and the legal reasons a person may have for saying one thing rather than another. That caution does not make the work cold. It makes it honest. You can be compassionate toward the families and still careful with the facts. You can be patient with a witness and still ask the hard question again. You can understand fear without letting it erase responsibility. In a cold case, kindness and rigor have to sit at the same table. The plea in 2020 gave the legal system a form of resolution against Busick, though not the full truth the families had sought. He was sentenced, and the courtroom portion of the case took its place in the record. Yet Ashley Freeman and Loria Bible were still not recovered. That is why the file does not grow quiet in the way a solved file might. It keeps a lamp burning over the map. You may find yourself thinking about maps often in this case. County roads, rural properties, mining areas, creeks, old paths known mostly to locals. A map looks clean on a desk, with lines, labels, and pale colors, but the land itself is uneven, scented with weeds and dust, full of fences, dips, locked gates, and memories attached to names that never appear in print. When searchers stand on that land, they are not standing on an abstraction. They feel sun on the backs of their necks, or cold air through their sleeves. They hear insects, engines, dogs, radios, and the soft shift of gravel underfoot. They carry the awareness that the families have imagined this same ground many times. Every step has to be practical, but it also has to be respectful. That respect is one of the quiet threads through the better parts of the investigation. Respect for the missing, whose names must not be treated as clues only. Respect for witnesses, even when their accounts are incomplete. Respect for the land, which cannot be searched carelessly. Respect for the limits of proof, because a case built on weak certainty can fail the very people it hopes to serve. As you move deeper into the file, You start to notice the rhythm of re-examination. An investigator returns to an old statement and asks whether a phrase was overlooked. Another compares a road name to a property record. Someone checks whether a person had access to a vehicle at a certain time. None of these tasks feels large alone, but together they form the slow craft of patient detective work. You can almost smell the warm toner of freshly copied pages. You can hear the paper cutter in another office, the low ring of a desk phone, the faint clatter of keys as names are entered into a database. Modern tools gradually entered the case, but the heart of the work remained human. Listen, compare, verify, and return to the unanswered place. Cold case work also depends on people being willing to disturb old quiet. That can be difficult in a small community. A person may fear being judged for waiting, another may fear retaliation, even years later. Someone may not want to reopen a wound in a family or in themselves. When you ask an old question, you are not just requesting information, you are asking someone to step back into a room they may have spent years avoiding. The detective's voice matters in that moment. It must be calm enough to allow memory, but firm enough to show that the question matters. You can hear it in your mind. Take your time. Start where you can. Tell me what you remember. The witness looks down at their hands. The room hums. Outside, cars pass on a road that has carried ordinary life for all the years the file has waited. Some memories arrive through the senses before they arrive as facts. A witness might remember the smell of smoke, the color of a truck, the sound of a name spoken in a kitchen, or the way someone lowered their voice. Those details may or may not become evidence, but they help investigators place a person back inside a moment. You too follow them carefully, because memory often begins as atmosphere. The Freeman case has always carried atmosphere strongly. The winter fire, the rural roads, the old mining country, the faded photographs, the years of posters, the courtroom benches. But atmosphere is not proof. It is the room around proof. We let it help us stay present, while the investigation itself still depends on the harder work of matching words to records and records to facts. That balance keeps the script gentle, and it kept the real work grounded. You can feel how easy it would have been for the public to choose one theory early and hold it forever. Some did. Others changed their minds as new information appeared. Detectives had to do something quieter. They had to leave space for correction, because the first version of a case is often not the truest one. The early suspicion around Danny Freeman is a clear example. Once Danny was found in the home, that suspicion could not stand in the same way. The case had to turn. A careful investigator must be willing to turn with it. You may feel the lesson under your fingers. Do not fall in love with an early theory, especially when smoke, grief, and confusion are still settling over the scene. The missed discovery of Danny also shows how public confidence can fracture. Families remember not only what investigators do, but what they fail to do. Years later, every new promise may be heard through that first failure. You can understand that without bitterness. Trust, once cracked, can still hold, but it has to be handled like old glass, supported from beneath, and never assumed to be whole. In later years, when law enforcement spoke more openly about suspects and charges, they were also speaking into that history. Every update carried the weight of earlier silence. Every search carried the weight of searches that had found nothing. Every request for information had to cross the weariness of people who had heard requests before. Yet the requests continued, because sometimes one person finally speaks after the 20th invitation. You can imagine the tip line ringing in a quiet office. The person who answers does not know whether the caller will offer confusion, cruelty, hope, or a small true thing. They take the call anyway. They write carefully. They ask for a name, a location, a year, a reason the caller believes this matters. Afterward, they place the note in the stream of the case, where it must be evaluated, without haste. The families also had to endure false hope. That phrase is common, but the experience is not common at all. False hope can come as a search, a claim, a rumor, a supposed confession, or a promised location. It can make a person prepare themselves for an answer, only to leave them standing in the same absence afterward. You read those passages softly, because hope, when mishandled, can become another injury. Still, hope was necessary. Without it, the file might have stayed closed in practice, even if open in name. Hope brought people back to the ground. Hope made witnesses reconsider silence. Hope made investigators reopen boxes and compare notes again. We can respect hope without making it bright or loud. In the Freeman case, hope often looked like persistence, which is quieter and more durable. As you sit with the renewed investigation, you may picture a large table covered with old and new materials. On one side, reports from 1999 and 2000. On another, later interviews, court documents and maps. In the middle, perhaps, photographs of Ashley and Loria, placed there not as evidence alone, but as orientation. The girls are why the table exists. That orientation matters because complicated cases can become crowded with the names of suspects. The public may remember the accused men, the rumors, the legal turns, and the disputed claims. But the patient investigator keeps returning to the missing. Ashley Freeman and Loria Bible were the reason every search party walked, every detective read, and every parent waited through another anniversary. Anniversaries in cold cases have their own texture. The weather may resemble the original day, or it may not. Reporters may call. Families may light candles, visit a place, speak to one another, or stay quiet. The calendar turns with no regard for readiness. You can feel how the 29th and 30th of December would never again be ordinary dates for those connected to the Freeman and Bible families. December itself can sharpen memory. The air smells of wood smoke and cold rain. Houses hold holiday lights and half-finished food. School is out. Families gather. Against that season, the disappearance of Ashley and Loria feels especially stark because the world around them should have been filled with simple rituals. Birthdays, sleepovers, end-of-year plans, and the small, tired happiness after Christmas. You do not need to make that contrast dramatic. It is already enough. A birthday sleepover became the opening line of a long investigation. A family home became a burned scene. A rural Oklahoma morning became a date people would repeat for decades. The file teaches you how ordinary life can become history without warning, and how the people left behind must keep living inside that history. By the time Busick's case reached its outcome, many of the original investigators were no longer in the same roles. Some had retired. Some had moved on. Newer investigators inherited not only the documents, but the consequences of earlier choices. You can imagine one detective reading another detective's handwriting from years before, trying to understand what was meant by an abbreviation or a margin note. That is another quiet challenge in cold case work. The file is a conversation across time, and not everyone who wrote into it is available to explain themselves. A note may say that a lead was checked, but not how thoroughly. A name may be spelled differently in two places. A map may lack a clear mark. The detective has to become an archivist, translator, and field worker all at once. You can hear the soft frustration in that work, though it never needs to become loud. A missing page means a phone call. A poor photocopy means another request. An unclear reference means a search through old records, property files, court databases, and memories. Patient detective work is often administrative before it is revelatory. It is form, folder, request, wait, follow-up, and then another wait. That waiting has texture too. It is the stale smell of a records office. It is the faint grit on a box pulled from storage. It is the cold metal edge of a filing cabinet drawer against your fingers. It is the way fluorescent light makes paper look flatter than it is. You sit with these ordinary sensations because they are where the work actually happens. The Freeman case reminds us that investigation is not only a chase. More often, it is custody. Custody of facts, custody of names, custody of mistakes, hopes, and unanswered questions. You hold them so they do not scatter. You preserve them so someone else can continue after you. That kind of custody is quiet, but it may be the only reason an old case can move at all. When the public thinks of old cases being reopened, it often imagines a sudden breakthrough. Sometimes that happens, but more often there is a slow gathering of conditions. A witness becomes ready. A prosecutor sees a path. A detective has time to reread. A family keeps pressure in place. A suspect loses the protection of old relationships. The door opens because many small hinges have been oiled over years. In the Freeman case, the later charges reflected that kind of gathering. They did not erase the years before. They did not restore what had been lost. But they showed that the file was not simply asleep on a shelf. Someone had been turning pages. Someone had been comparing accounts. Someone had been asking whether the old silence had weakened enough for a case to pass through. You can imagine the moment an investigator recognizes that a path may now exist. It is not a shout. It may be a quiet look across a table, a finger resting on a line of text, a sentence spoken carefully. This matches what another witness said. Then comes more work, not less. The possible path must be checked, reinforced, challenged, and made ready for the legal world beyond the office. The legal world has its own slow rhythm. Motions, hearings, continuances, negotiations, filings, and appearances can stretch time in ways families find exhausting. You can picture a calendar marked and remarked, dates circled, then moved. A courtroom day may be anticipated for weeks, only to end with another delay. The case advances, but not always in a way the heart can feel. For the families, each delay could reopen the same questions. Will he say where they are? Will the court require it? Will today be the day something changes? You sit with those questions because they matter more than the procedural language around them. Behind every filing was a family still wanting to bring Ashley and Loria home. The public record indicated that Busick was expected, as part of the process around his plea, to assist with locating the girls. Yet the recovery did not come. That fact sits quietly but heavily in the file. A promise of help is not the same as help that leads somewhere. A statement about a location is not the same as finding someone. The difference is where families live. You can feel the ache of searches that follow such information. The team arrives. Equipment is unloaded. The place is marked. People work for hours or days. Maybe the weather turns. Maybe the ground resists. Maybe nothing is found. Then the equipment is packed again, and the land returns to its usual silence, while the family must absorb another version of not yet. Not yet is a phrase cold case families know too well. Not solved yet, not found yet, not enough yet. It sounds temporary, and sometimes it is. But when repeated for years, it becomes part of the atmosphere of a life. You can hear it in official updates, in family interviews, in the careful optimism of search teams, and in the quiet way people say they are still hoping. The detective tonight, the one you are becoming as you listen, has to honor that phrase without being defeated by it. Not yet means the work can continue. Not yet means someone may still remember. Not yet means a box may still hold an overlooked page. It is a hard phrase, but it leaves a narrow passage through which patients can keep moving. As the investigation stretched across decades, technology changed around it. Databases grew more connected, mapping tools improved, communications shifted from landlines and local papers to digital archives and online discussion. But no technology could replace the simplest need in the Freeman case. Someone with knowledge had to tell enough truth to lead searchers to the right place. You can sit with that simplicity. It is almost unbearable because it is so plain. After all the reports, theories, court dates, and searches, the case still bends toward a human mouth opening and saying where. A word, a road, a landmark, a bend in a creek, a property once visited. The file waits for specificity, because specificity is the bridge between story and ground. The old allegations around photographs and captivity added another layer to that need. If people had seen evidence of the girls after the night they disappeared, then there were more witnesses than the first scene suggested. More people had knowledge, more people carried something. You read that gently, because the thought can become too sharp if held carelessly. The investigation had to turn that moral weight into usable evidence. Usable evidence is a plain phrase, but it carries discipline. It means something can be presented, tested, and relied upon. It means a witness can explain how they know. It means a location can be checked. It means a detail is not merely repeated, but anchored. Patient detective work is the long movement from terrible possibility toward usable fact. In the file, You can feel investigators trying to make that movement. They ask who was present. They ask how a person knew. They ask whether anyone else heard the same thing. They ask where the conversation happened, what time of year it was, what vehicle was there, what road was taken, what building stood nearby. The questions are simple, and the answers matter. The human element remains quiet but constant. A witness may cry, another may shut down, another may become defensive. Someone may say they were afraid of Welch, or Pennington, or others connected to that circle. Someone may insist they only heard talk. The detective must keep the room steady. You can hear the soft rustle of tissues, the pause after a difficult answer, and the pen returning to the page. No investigation can change the fact that years were lost. That truth sits beside every later development. You can prosecute after years. You can search after years. You can correct a theory after years. But you cannot return the first morning to itself. You cannot unburn the house or give investigators back the untouched scene. Cold case work often begins by accepting that the original chance was imperfect. Acceptance is not resignation. You learn that here. Acceptance means knowing what cannot be recovered, so the remaining work can be done cleanly. It means no pretending. It means no dramatic certainty where the evidence is thin. It means honoring the missing by refusing to build a false answer merely because the true one has taken too long. As we move through this middle part of the Freeman case, the pace should stay slow enough for the details to settle. The fire is behind us in the timeline, but its effects remain. The early assumptions are behind us, but their consequences remain. The arrests and court proceedings are ahead and around us, but the central absence remains. You can feel how a case becomes layered, not linear. Layer by layer, the file asks to be read differently. First, as an emergency, then as a missing person search, then as a homicide investigation, then as a cold case, then as a prosecution built from old statements and newer cooperation. Each layer has its own smell and sound. Smoke, phones, paper, courtroom wood, and the quiet scrape of storage boxes. You may notice that the girls themselves appear in the file mostly through what others remember. Ashley's birthday, Lauria's sleepover, their friendship, their photographs, their absence from the burned home. That is often how missing people are held in investigative paper. They are present through echoes. The task, for everyone who reads, is to keep those echoes human and not let them become mere case markers. Ashley Freeman was part of the family at the center of the home. Lauria Bible was the friend who came to spend the night. Those roles sound simple, but simplicity is not small. A daughter, a friend, a teenager at a birthday sleepover. You hold that picture because it resists the coldness that can gather around famous cases. Before the file, there was ordinary life. Ordinary life leaves traces investigators understand well. Clothing, school items, photographs, phone numbers, plans made casually. The kind of details someone mentions without knowing it will matter later. You can picture a room where a teenage girl had left things in the easy confidence of returning. That confidence, once broken, becomes one of the quietest details in the entire case. The family's public advocacy kept returning attention to that broken ordinary life. They did not ask the world to solve an abstraction. They asked for Ashley and Lauria. They asked for information. They asked people to remember. You can hear the controlled steadiness in that kind of public speaking, the way grief learns to stand at microphones because silence has not worked. For law enforcement, family advocacy can be pressure, partnership, and reminder all at once. It can make a case harder to ignore. It can also make every delay more visible. In the Freeman case, that visibility mattered. Without it, old rumors might have faded into local talk, and the larger public might have stopped recognizing the girls' names. Persistence kept a small light on the file. You can imagine detectives seeing those names in the news again after an anniversary segment. A new call comes in. A retired officer remembers a note. A former neighbor decides to speak. Public attention is not evidence, but it can stir the conditions that produce evidence. The key is to receive what comes in with care, neither dismissing it nor believing too quickly. That care extends to the accused as well, in the narrow but important sense that the investigation must be fair. Patient detective work does not mean deciding first and proving later. It means following the evidence where it can honestly go. In a case filled with pain, fairness is not softness toward wrongdoing. It is the discipline that keeps the result from becoming another failure. You see this in how the case against Busick had to be formed. Prosecutors could not simply present decades of rumor and ask a court to feel what the families felt. They had to work with admissible evidence, witness credibility, legal standards, and the difficulty of deceased alleged co-offenders. The courtroom asks for a certain kind of truth, and not every true grief can enter in the form the family wishes. That gap between lived truth and courtroom truth can be hard to bear. You may know something in your bones. You may have heard enough over years to feel the outline of what happened. But the court must move through rules, because rules protect everyone, including the integrity of the case itself. The families had to live inside that gap, and investigators had to build across it as best they could. When Busick entered his plea, the public learned more about the official view of the case. But even then, the full story did not become simple. Welch and Pennington were gone. The girls were still missing. The specific path from the Freeman home to wherever Ashley and Loria were taken remained incomplete. You can feel how the file resists closure, even when a court date seems to offer it. Closure is a word people use often around cold cases. It is not always a helpful word. Some families prefer answers, recovery, accountability, or truth. Closure can sound like a door shutting, when what they really need is a light turned on in the room that has stayed dark for years. In the Freeman case, the legal door moved, but the dark room remained. So we keep reading, quietly. We do not force the ending. We let the middle be as long as it was, because for the families, the middle lasted decades. It included holidays, searches, news interviews, court dates, and private mornings when no one from the outside world was watching. It included hope that had to be rebuilt after each disappointment, like a small fence repaired after weather. There is a kind of bravery in returning to a case file that has hurt you before. Detectives may feel it in one way, families in another. Each return risks another failure to find the missing thing. Yet not returning would feel worse, because not returning would leave the silence unchallenged. You can sense that quiet bravery whenever the file is opened again. The physical act of opening a file is simple. A hand lifts a cover, a page turns, a staple catches slightly. But in an old case, that act is also a promise. I will look again. I will not assume the last person saw everything. I will let the record speak, and I will listen for what it has not yet been able to say. That promise is why cold case work can feel almost devotional. Not religious necessarily, but devoted in the plain sense of attention given over time. Attention becomes a form of care. Care becomes a form of resistance against forgetting. And in the Freeman case, resistance against forgetting was one of the strongest tools the families and investigators had. As you sit beside the file tonight, you may feel the pace of the investigation slowing and deepening rather than racing. The early emergency has passed. The public shock has passed. The rumors have aged. What remains is the quieter work of sorting what can still be known from what has become unreachable. That sorting is not dramatic, but it is honest. The next pages take us toward the search efforts that followed the later legal developments, and toward the way the land itself seemed to keep asking for more patience. The land in the later searches did not offer itself easily, and you can feel that difficulty the moment the file begins to speak of old mining areas, rural properties, and places changed by weather. A search team may arrive with maps, equipment, and testimony, but the ground has its own memory and it does not arrange itself for human need. You stand there in your mind, feeling grit under your boots, while the Freeman case asks one more time whether the land is holding what the paper cannot provide. You can picture the search planners leaning over a map, one finger following a county road, another stopping at a place mentioned in an interview. The paper map lies flat, but every line on it becomes rougher outside the office, where weeds grow over tracks and old structures collapse into themselves. The air might smell of dust, grass, and rusted metal. Someone reads from a witness statement, and everyone listens for the small word that might turn a large area into a smaller one. This is the patience of search work. and it is different from the patience of interviews. In an interview room, you wait for memory to become speech. In the field, you wait for speech to become ground. You may have a phrase like near the old place, or by the pit, or past the road that used to be there, and each phrase needs to be translated into something a team can actually walk. The Freeman case had many such translations. Welch, Oklahoma, was the beginning, but the investigation spread outward across a wider human and physical landscape. You follow it with your eyes, half on the file and half on the map, noticing how a rural case rarely stays inside one town's boundary. People move between homes, properties, roads, workplaces, and old gathering places, leaving traces that do not respect neat jurisdictional lines. Jurisdiction itself can become part of the work. One agency begins, another assists. A sheriff's office holds one kind of record, a state bureau another, a court clerk another. You can hear the quiet friction of that process in the shuffle of papers and the ringing of phones. Nobody solves a case merely by wanting the documents to meet each other. Someone has to carry the request, wait for the answer, and ask again when the first answer is incomplete. The old file would have known that friction well. Reports from the first days, later interviews, court documents, search notes, and family materials all had to speak to one another across time. You can imagine a detective placing pages in chronological order, then changing the order because a timeline of events is not always the same as a timeline of knowledge. The case happened once, but people learned it in pieces. That difference matters. On the 30th of December 1999, investigators knew only what they could see and what they were told. Years later, they knew more about suspects, claims, and possible movements after the fire. You, reading now, have the advantage and the burden of hindsight. It is easy to see where early questions should have gone, but the file asks you to understand how fogged the first hours were. Understanding is not the same as excusing. You can hold both thoughts gently. The first scene was mishandled in ways that hurt trust and possibly the case. The people working that morning were also facing smoke, loss, confusion, and a situation that changed as new facts appeared. A patient investigator learns to name failures clearly, without letting anger become the only light in the room. In the later searches, every early failure became a reason to be more careful. You can feel that care in the way teams would document locations, mark grids, and preserve any possible findings. The ground might be uneven underfoot. The sky might be white with heat or low with rain. A radio might crackle against someone's shoulder while the search line advances slowly, each person watching the earth in front of them. Searches in old cases often include long stretches where nothing visible happens. That is not wasted time. It is exclusion. A field checked carefully becomes one less field to wonder about, though even that certainty has limits. You can imagine a report saying that an area was searched with negative results, a dry phrase that hides hours of sweat, sore knees, and the quiet disappointment of loading the equipment again. Negative results are part of the Freeman case, and they have their own weight. They do not give the families what they need, but they still shape the next question. If not here, then where? If not this witness's memory, then which part failed? Was the location wrong? The time wrong? The landmark changed? Or the account itself unreliable? Each unanswered search leaves a residue of new questions. You can almost see the searchers at the end of a day, brushing dust from their clothes, their faces lined from sun and concentration. Someone drinks water from a bottle gone warm. Someone checks a clipboard. Someone speaks softly to a family member or an officer standing nearby. There is no dramatic music in this kind of work. There is only the sober knowledge that effort was given and the answer did not come. The families had to receive those days, one after another. You can imagine waiting for a call during a search, afraid of what it might say, and afraid it will say nothing. That is a narrow emotional place, and it can last for hours, days, or years. The phone feels heavier. The house sounds too quiet. Every update has to pass through hope before it reaches understanding. When we sit with the Freeman case in this calm way, we are not trying to make the waiting beautiful. We are trying to make it visible. The waiting was made of real mornings, real calendars, and real bodies growing tired. It was made of families who kept showing up, and investigators who kept reopening a matter that would have been easier, in bureaucratic terms, to let fade. Cold cases depend on people who refuse easy fading. Sometimes that person is a detective near retirement who remembers a detail from years before. Sometimes it is a parent who keeps a binder on a shelf. Sometimes it is a younger investigator who was a child when the case began but brings fresh eyes to the file. You can feel those lives overlapping inside the paper, each one touching the case at a different season. The records themselves age in physical ways. Ink lightens, staples rust, photographs stick slightly to plastic sleeves, a folder label curls at the corner where many hands have lifted it. You may think of evidence as fixed, and in law it must be preserved as fixed, but every object still lives inside time. The investigator's task is to guard it as carefully as possible against that slow weathering. In the Freeman case, the fire made preservation difficult from the very beginning. Fire consumes, but it also confuses. It changes surfaces, destroys context, and invites mistaken assumptions. Water used to fight fire changes things again. Then weather, foot traffic, and time add more disturbance. You can see why later detectives had to rely so heavily on witness accounts and reconstructed timelines, because the original scene could no longer speak in a full voice. That partial voice is one of the saddest features of the file. A house usually contains thousands of ordinary details. The angle of a chair, the place where shoes are left, the cup near the sink, the smell of laundry, food, dust, and sleep. After the fire, much of that ordinary language was gone, and what remained had to be interpreted through damage. You read the fire reports and scene descriptions with caution. You do not ask them to tell more than they can. You let them tell what they can. Where remains were found, what areas burned, what was first seen, what was missed, what was later recognized. The file becomes an exercise in restraint, because an honest investigation must know when a page is speaking and when the reader is filling silence. Filling silence is a human habit. In an unresolved case, people do it almost automatically. They imagine motives, movements, hidden conversations, and final routes. Some of that imagination can help generate questions, but it cannot be allowed to become proof. You, as the detective tonight, let imagination walk beside you only as far as the evidence path allows. The later legal case against Busick required that same restraint. Prosecutors had to decide what could be proven after so much loss, so many years. And the deaths of Welch and Pennington, you can picture them in a conference room, files stacked in front of them, voices kept low because the subject itself requires respect. The fluorescent lights hum. Someone turns a page and says, "This witness can say this, but not that." That distinction may sound small, but it can determine the shape of a case. A witness who heard something directly is different from a witness who heard it from someone else. A statement made close in time may carry different weight from one made after public discussion. A detail corroborated by another source may stand more firmly. The law asks these questions not to be cold, but to keep the process from drifting. Still, the legal process can feel cold to families. You can understand why. They carry the whole person, while the courtroom often carries only admissible portions. A judge may rule that certain words cannot be heard. An attorney may narrow a question. A document may be sealed, delayed, or reduced to language that feels too small for the loss it represents. The family sits there, holding what the courtroom cannot hold. In the Freeman case, the plea avoided some uncertainties of trial, but it also meant that many questions did not receive the public testing a trial might have provided. That is not unusual. Pleas are common. They can provide accountability when evidence is difficult, when witnesses are vulnerable, or when legal risk is high. But for listeners like us, and for families most of all, they can leave a soft hollow where more detail was hoped for. You can sit with that hollow without trying to fill it. Busick's plea became part of the official record, and yet Ashley Freeman and Loria Bible remained missing. That fact gave the legal result a muted quality, as if the courtroom light reached only partway into the old room. The file gained a new page, but the map still held blank spaces. Maps can be cruel in that way. They show so much with confidence. and yet the place you need most may not be marked. A road, a pond, a property line, a mine opening, an abandoned foundation, all may be clear, while the true location remains hidden somewhere between memory and ground. You run your finger over the paper and feel how little pressure the land returns. The investigators who searched after the plea had to work inside that uncertainty. You can imagine them reviewing what Busick said, comparing it with older statements and asking whether any part of it could be turned into a search area. A detail might seem useful in an office and dissolve outside, where trees, fences, and time have rearranged the view. The work becomes not just finding, but interpreting. Interpretation is delicate when the source may be unreliable. A person might mislead to protect themselves. They might misremember. They might repeat something another person said. They might describe a place as it was decades earlier, not as it is now. The detective has to listen for the small, durable pieces, a direction, a surface, a sound, a name, a distance that can be tested. You can hear that testing in the questions. Was the road paved then? Was there a gate? Did you cross water? Were there lights nearby? Could you see a house from there? How long did it take to drive? These are not dramatic questions, but they are the tools by which a vague memory may become a search plan. Each answer narrows or widens the quiet circle. The Freeman case, because of its rural setting, asked many such ground-based questions. Rural landscapes can look open from a distance, but up close, they are full of private knowledge. A person knows which road turns muddy after rain, which gate is usually locked, which property has an old shed, which place teenagers used to meet, which hollow cannot be seen from the main road. Investigators often need local memory to read the land. Local memory, again, is not simple. It belongs to people with loyalties, fears, grudges, and imperfect recollection. You can picture an older resident sitting at a kitchen table, tracing a route with one finger on a paper map, then pausing because the road name changed years ago. The room smells of coffee and dust. A clock ticks. The detective waits, because rushing memory can scatter it. When the memory returns, it may arrive sideways. Not the road name, but the dog that lived there. Not the year, but the winter after a cousin moved away. Not the exact property, but the color of a trailer that has long since been removed. You learn, in old rural cases, that time is often measured by people and objects, rather than official dates. That kind of memory can still matter. An investigator can take the partial description and compare it with property records, aerial images, older maps, and other witnesses. The work is slow, almost textile in its patience, one thread crossing another until something like a pattern appears. You can feel the soft concentration of it, the way a detective's eyes move from document to map and back again. The case also required emotional translation. Witnesses who had lived around frightening people may not speak in clean legal categories. They may say, "I heard things," or "everyone knew," or "he was dangerous," or "I didn't want trouble." Those phrases carry lived experience, but they must be unpacked carefully. What did you hear? Who said it? When did you hear it? What made you believe it? You can ask those questions gently and still ask them firmly. That is the tone this file needs. No accusation in the voice unless the evidence requires it. No impatience when a witness struggles. Just the steady return to clarity. In a case where rumor did so much moving, clarity becomes a kindness, not only to the court, but to Ashley and Loria. Every time their names appear, the file becomes less abstract. Ashley Freeman. Loria Bible. 2 teenagers, one hosting a birthday sleepover, one spending the night at a friend's house. Both pulled into an investigation that would outlast their adolescence, their peers' graduations, and many ordinary milestones. You turn the page slowly, because the names deserve that small act of care. The difference between adolescence and a case file is painful. Teenage life is unfinished by nature. It is made of plans, changes, opinions, music, friends, family tensions, favorite clothes, and the sense that adulthood is close, but not yet clear. A case file freezes all of that into identifiers, dates, and photographs. The investigator has to work with the identifiers while remembering the life behind them. That remembering can affect how questions are asked. You are not looking for a body as an object. You are looking for a daughter and a friend who need to be returned to their families. you are not checking a tip to satisfy curiosity. You are checking it because someone has lived for decades without the most basic answer. The language may stay professional, but the purpose remains human. In the later years, the families often had to speak publicly in order to keep that purpose visible. Public speaking after long loss is not easy. You can imagine the bright light of a camera, the microphone held close, the need to say the same painful facts again without letting your voice break too much for strangers. The air in those moments can feel thin, and yet the words are necessary. The public hears a short segment. The family lives the unedited version. That is worth remembering as we move through the Freeman case. A television report may compress years into minutes. A headline may turn a legal development into a brief phrase, but in the real human timeline, each event is connected to years of calls, searches, disappointments, and private conversations no one outside the family will ever hear. Investigators also live with an unedited version, though differently. Some cases follow a detective home, not because the detective wants drama, but because the unanswered question remains active in the mind. You can picture a detective washing a cup at the sink and suddenly thinking of a road name, or waking early with a connection between two statements. The file may be locked away, but thought keeps moving. That kind of thought can become a burden if not managed. Patient detectives learn to pace themselves. They know that obsession can blur judgment, while indifference can kill a case. The middle way is steady attention, open the file, work the lead, rest when needed, return. You can feel the discipline in that cycle, like breathing measured through a long winter night. The Freeman case required many returns. Returning to the first scene, returning to the missing girls, returning to suspects whose names had been spoken before, returning to witnesses who might now say more, returning to land that had already been searched, because a new statement may place attention on a slightly different spot. The repetition is not failure. It is the nature of old work. Repetition also helps the half-hidden details stand out. The first time you read a statement, a phrase may pass unnoticed. The third time, after another witness has spoken, that same phrase may begin to glow softly. You underline it. You compare it. You ask whether it is coincidence or connection. The room is quiet, and for a few minutes, the old file feels newly awake. But even a newly awake file can become still again. Leads close, witnesses become unavailable. Searches end without recovery. Legal options narrow. You learn not to mistake stillness for death. In cold case work, stillness is often part of the cycle. The file rests until another person, another tool, or another memory makes movement possible. That resting can be hard for families to accept, and understandably so. A family does not experience the case as one of many assignments. It is the assignment. It is the open question at the center of their calendar. When investigators say there is nothing new to report, they may mean the statement carefully and truthfully, but the words can still land like another closed door. You can imagine receiving that kind of update after years. Nothing new, still working, still open. Each phrase is meant to reassure, but it may also feel like fog. The family listens, thanks the person, hangs up, and returns to the house where the missing person's photograph has not aged. That moment rarely appears in official records, yet it is part of the case's true life. The official record tends to mark action: arrest, plea, search, statement, charge. The lived record includes waiting, doubting, remembering, and trying again. A calm retelling should hold both. If we only follow the legal events, we miss the human endurance. If we only follow grief, we miss the craft of investigation. The Freeman case is where those two records meet, imperfectly, but persistently. As we continue through the searches, it is useful to imagine the practical decisions behind them. A team cannot search everywhere at once. It must choose based on information, feasibility, safety, and permission. Old mines or unstable ground may require specialized support. Private land may require contact. Weather may delay work. The need is urgent in feeling, but the process must remain careful in action. Careful action can look slow from outside. You may wonder why a place was not searched sooner, or why a search did not last longer. Sometimes the answer is obvious. and sometimes it is hidden in logistics. Equipment availability, hazard assessment, jurisdiction, funding, land access, and witness reliability all matter. The file may not show every constraint, but the field team feels them in real time. There is a humility in recognizing constraints. It does not reduce the urgency of finding Ashley and Loria. It simply describes the world in which the search had to happen. Ground must be entered safely. Evidence must be preserved properly. Searches must be documented. A mistake made in haste can damage the answer everyone has waited so long to receive. You can picture a search leader pausing before a difficult area, not out of reluctance, but out of responsibility. The air may be hot and still. The team may be ready. Yet the ground may require a different approach, another tool, or a specialist who understands the hazard. Waiting in that moment can feel painful, but patient care is sometimes the only ethical choice. In old mining regions, patience is also physical safety. Sinkholes, unstable shafts, contaminated soil, and loose material can turn a search into danger. The land has been opened and altered by earlier industry, and those changes remain long after the mines stop working. You can smell dust in the air and feel the strange give of disturbed ground underfoot. The searcher has to respect that. Respecting the land does not mean surrendering to it. It means learning how to ask it questions properly. Ground-penetrating tools, excavation plans, dogs, aerial imagery, and local knowledge may all become part of the conversation. Each method has limits. Each method has strengths. The patient investigator does not expect one tool to do all the work. The Freeman case drew on that layered approach over time, not always in ways visible to the public. Many search decisions remain behind the scenes, recorded in reports or remembered by those who were there. You can imagine the quiet disappointment when a promising lead fails, and also the quiet resolve that follows. Document it, preserve the result, and move to the next lead. Documenting a failed search may sound mundane, but it matters. Years later, another investigator needs to know what was checked, how it was checked, and why. Without that record, the same ground may be searched poorly or unnecessarily, while other ground is neglected. A careful negative result becomes a gift to the future, even though it feels like sorrow in the present. You can feel that future-minded care in the best cold case work. The detective is not only working for today's answer, they are working for the next detective, the next family meeting, the next technological tool, the next witness who may speak. The file becomes a bridge across years, and every clear note strengthens it. The Freeman case needed bridges because time kept widening the distance from the first night. Witnesses aged, physical places changed, public memory shifted, the law moved slowly, yet the case remained reachable because enough people kept building those bridges. Families, investigators, reporters, volunteers, and community members who refused to let the names disappear completely. Community members can play complicated roles in old cases. Some help openly, some help quietly, some repeat rumors that make the work harder. Some know more than they say. You do not need to judge each person from a distance. You simply notice how a small community can hold both care and fear, both loyalty and silence, and how an investigation has to move through all of it. Fear may have been one reason certain information took so long to surface. When suspects are perceived as dangerous, people may protect themselves by staying quiet. That silence can be morally costly, but fear is not imaginary just because it is inconvenient to the case. You can hold that complexity gently. The silence hurt the search for Ashley and Loria, and the people who stayed silent may have been afraid. A detective trying to break that silence must create conditions where truth feels possible. Sometimes that means building trust over more than one conversation. Sometimes it means protecting a witness's safety. Sometimes it means confronting a person with contradictions. The work is not simply asking, "What do you know?" It is also asking, "What kept you from saying it? And what will let you say it now?" You can hear the quiet shift when a witness finally decides to speak more plainly. The voice may drop. The room may feel smaller. Details come slowly, perhaps out of order. The detective lets the person continue, then returns to the points that need clarity. Outside, the day may be completely ordinary, with traffic, errands, and sunlight on windows, while inside, a case that has waited years receives one more piece. Not every piece fits. That is another difficult truth. Some late statements may be inaccurate, exaggerated, or shaped by memory's erosion. The investigator has to be grateful for the attempt and careful with the content. You can thank a witness and still verify every line. In fact, verification is part of respect, because the missing deserve truth, not merely sincerity. The Freeman case became known partly because truth seemed to have been obscured by so many layers. Early assumptions, local distrust, rumors, unrecovered photographs, dead suspects, a plea without recovery. Each layer added its own shadow. Patient detective work does not tear through those shadows wildly. It carries a lamp, moves slowly, and accepts that some corners may remain dim for a long time. That image of the lamp matters because it matches the pace of the file. You are not running. You are seated at a desk, perhaps late at night, with the room quiet around you. The pages have a soft rasp when you turn them. The air smells of paper and cooling tea. Somewhere beyond the window, a car passes and fades. The case remains open in front of you, asking for attention rather than alarm. Attention can be given to small procedural details too. Chain of custody, interview dates, search logs, evidence storage, court filings. These may not sound moving, but they are the spine of the work. Without them, even the most compassionate investigation can lose its strength. You can think of them as the quiet bones of the case, holding shape under everything else. The early fire scene made chain and preservation especially important. Anything recovered had to be documented. Anything missing had to be noted. Later, when questions arose about what was missed, the documentation itself became part of the story. You can feel how one imperfect morning can echo for decades through hearings, interviews, and family conversations. That echo teaches future investigators. It says, slow down at the scene. Look again. Let trained eyes search before assumptions harden. Preserve uncertainty where uncertainty exists. A case can survive many difficulties, but it is always easier to protect the truth at the beginning than to reconstruct it years later from damaged pieces. Still, reconstruction is possible sometimes, and that possibility is why cold case work continues. A missing original clue does not mean every answer is gone. Witnesses may remain, documents may remain, suspects may speak, technology may reveal something new, landscapes may be searched again. The work becomes harder, but harder is not the same as impossible. In the F. Freeman case, the later prosecution showed that some form of reconstruction had occurred. It did not provide everything. It did not find Ashley and Loria, but it gathered enough of the old and new material to bring Busick before the court and secure an official outcome. That matters, even while we acknowledge the profound incompleteness that remained. You may feel that incompleteness most clearly when thinking about the girls' families after the court process. Other people might assume a sentence brings an ending. Families know better. If the missing is still missing, every legal milestone is only part of the story. The courtroom empties. The reporters leave. The file is updated. Then the family goes home, and the question of where remains in the room. Where is a small word. It is one of the smallest and heaviest words in the Freeman case. Where did Ashley and Loria go after the fire? Where were they kept, if the later accounts are accurate? Where were they taken afterward? Where should searchers look now? You can feel how the word repeats without becoming dramatic, because repetition is exactly how the question has lived. A detective may write where at the top of a page, then list possibilities underneath. A family member may say where in a prayer, a phone call, or a quiet thought while driving. A searcher may think where while scanning a tree line. The word belongs to everyone touched by the case, and yet no one has been able to make it settle. This is why a location tip can carry so much force. It seems to promise an end to where. Even a vague tip can make people lean forward. But the lean must be controlled. Search plans need more than longing. They need coordinates, permissions, safety plans, and enough factual basis to justify the work. The heart may be ready before the ground is. You can feel the discipline of holding back until the search can be done properly. That discipline is not indifference, it is care under pressure. Rushing into a hazardous or poorly defined area may waste time, risk safety, or damage evidence. Waiting for the right conditions may feel cruel, but it can be the only way to honor the possibility that the answer is there. The families, of course, had waited so long that every additional delay could feel like too much. You can understand that completely. If your child were missing, patience would not feel noble. It would feel imposed. It would feel like something the world demanded while giving too little in return. That is why the word patience in this case should never be made pretty. It was necessary, but it was costly. For investigators, patience also carried cost. Many law enforcement professionals enter cold case work knowing they may never see the final answer. They may devote years to a file and leave it to another person. That can be humbling. You do the work anyway, because the value is not only in being the one who finishes. Sometimes the value is in preserving the path well enough for someone else to continue. That idea sits gently beside the Freeman case. Some people began the work, others corrected it, others reopened it, others carried it into court, others searched again. No single person owned the whole investigation. It was passed along, sometimes imperfectly, from hand to hand, like a fragile object wrapped in paper that had already been torn in places. You can imagine those hands. A firefighter's gloved hand, a parent's trembling hand, a detective's ink-stained hand, a clerk's hand stamping a document, a volunteer's hand pushing a side brush, a prosecutor's hand turning a page in court, a family member's hand touching a photograph. The case moved through all of them, gathering the warmth and wear of human effort. As we continue, the searches begin to feel less like isolated events and more like a repeated question addressed to the land. The land does not answer in words. It answers only if something is found, or if something is not found carefully enough to change the map of possibility. You stand with the searchers in that quiet exchange, listening to wind, radios, and footsteps. Some days, the weather would have made the work harder. Heat presses down, making dust cling to skin. Rain softens ground and blurs tracks. Cold stiffens fingers and makes equipment awkward. Each condition changes what can be done. You can feel the patience in choosing the right day, or continuing through the wrong one, because a lead feels too important to leave waiting. The sensory world of a search is very different from the sensory world of an archive. In the archive, paper breathes dust. In the field, earth breathes dampness, minerals, grass, and decay. In the archive, the sound is pages and chairs. In the field, the sound is wind, brush, distant engines, and the occasional call from one searcher to another. The same case lives in both worlds. The detective has to move between those worlds without losing the thread. A statement in the archive sends the team to the field. A result in the field sends the detective back to the statement. Did the witness mean this place or a similar one? Did the landmark exist then? Did the route make sense? You can see the looping motion. File to land to file, over and over. That looping motion can last years. It may look repetitive to an outsider, but each loop can refine the question. A search may eliminate an area. A new aerial image may show an old roadbed. A witness may clarify a direction. A property record may identify who had access at the relevant time. The answer, if it comes, may come from the accumulation of refinements rather than a single revelation. The Freeman case had no shortage of painful possibilities, but the patient method was always the same. Bring the possibility into the light. Test it. Keep what holds. Set aside what does not. Return to the girls' names. Return to the map. Return to the family. Return to the file. This repetition is not meant to wake the listener. It is meant to show the slow pulse of the work. Even now, as you listen, you may feel the file settling around you like a quiet room. The lamplight touches the page. The old photographs lie nearby. The map waits under one hand. Outside, the night can be ordinary, and that ordinariness is part of the comfort. We are not chasing the case through darkness. We are sitting with it, patiently, giving it the attention it was always owed. The next set of pages brings us closer to the people who kept that attention alive when official movement slowed, and to the small acts of remembrance that prevented Ashley Freeman and Loria Bible from becoming only names in an old report. Those acts of remembrance are not separate from investigation, even when they happen far from interview rooms and search teams. You can feel that in the way a photograph is kept clear, the way a date is spoken each year, and the way a family corrects a detail when the public record drifts. In the Freeman case, memory became a kind of evidence of devotion, not evidence for court, perhaps, but evidence that Ashley Freeman and Loria Bible had people who would keep calling them back by name. You can imagine Laureen and Jay Bible at a table with papers spread out, the room warmed by a small lamp while the rest of the house grows quiet. There may be clippings, handwritten notes, printed messages, and old photographs in protective sleeves. The work of a parent in a cold case can resemble office work from the outside, but every page touches the heart. You turn one page, and it is not merely a document, it is another attempt to reach your child. That kind of private archive matters, because official files are not the only records that survive. Families remember which reporter called, which officer promised an update, which rumor arrived after which television program, and which search left them newly tired. Their memory may not be formal, but it can preserve the chronology of care. You can feel the paper edges under their hands, the careful stacking, the reluctance to throw anything away. In a case as long as the Freeman case, families often become the people who notice when the story is being told too thinly. They know when Ashley is being reduced to one sentence. They know when Loria's friendship is treated only as a circumstance. They know when early mistakes are softened too much, or when rumors are repeated without enough care. They become guardians of proportion. Proportion is a quiet word, but it matters here. A compassionate retelling must not give more space to the accused than to the missing. It must not let procedural error swallow the girls themselves. It must not let the pain of the case become entertainment. You, sitting with the file tonight, keep adjusting the balance, the way a careful hand adjusts a photograph under glass until the face is clear. The faces in this case stayed young. That is one of the sorrowful facts of missing person photographs. The public keeps seeing the same age, while parents and friends age around the image. Ashley and Loria remain teenagers in the posters, their expressions fixed in a time before court hearings, plea agreements, and decades of unanswered searches. The photograph becomes a door that will not open, but everyone keeps standing near it. You can hear the steadiness required to speak those names publicly year after year. Ashley Freeman, Loria Bible. The names have to be said clearly, because names resist disappearance. They remind listeners that the case is not only the Freeman home, not only the fire, not only the suspects, not only the court. It is also two young lives that remain central, no matter how complicated the investigation becomes. Public remembrance can gather people who never knew the missing personally. Someone sees a segment late at night. Someone reads a story years later. Someone remembers a conversation from long ago, because a photograph stirs a detail loose. That is one reason families keep speaking. A case can go quiet in official channels, then move again because public memory brushes against private knowledge. You can picture a person hearing the case discussed on a local broadcast, perhaps while washing dishes or driving home in the dark. The voice on the radio says, "Welch, Oklahoma," and the listener pauses. A fragment returns, a name, a remark, a place once mentioned. They may dismiss it at first. Then the thought stays with them, resting in the mind like a folded note that will not quite disappear. Whether that person calls can depend on many things: fear, doubt, shame, loyalty, the belief that someone else must already have told investigators, the worry that memory has become unreliable. You can understand how silence grows out of those feelings, even as you understand the harm silence can do. The detective's task is to make one more call feel possible. In the Freeman case, every public appeal carried that hope. Not a loud hope, and not an easy one. Just the hope that one person, somewhere, might know the road, the field, the pit, the abandoned place, or the person who knew. You can feel the smallness and largeness of that hope at once. It asks for one detail, and that one detail could change decades. Families sometimes learn to speak in phrases meant for strangers. If you know something, come forward. If you heard something, call. If you are afraid, there are ways to help. Those phrases may sound familiar, but each time a family says them, they are spending something. You can hear the emotional labor in the careful voice, the way dignity holds grief upright in public. The case also lived in community gatherings and anniversaries. Candles may be lit, photographs may be displayed, people may stand together under a grey December sky, coats pulled close, breath visible in the air. The sound is soft, murmured greetings, a sniffle, a prayer, the rustle of paper. Remembrance is not investigation in the narrow sense, but it keeps the world from moving entirely on. Moving on is another phrase that can be difficult. The world moves because it must. Stores open, children grow, roads are repaired, new families move into old places. Yet for those closest to the Freeman case, moving on may have meant carrying the case forward rather than leaving it behind. You can think of it as walking with a weight that shifts, but does not vanish. Investigators, too, may attend or observe these public moments. A vigil is not only grief. It can be a place where people speak more freely afterward, where old acquaintances gather, where someone who has avoided a formal office feels able to approach. You can imagine a detective standing near the edge, coat collar raised against the cold, listening respectfully, not intruding, but aware that memory sometimes moves in gatherings. The atmosphere of such a night would be gentle and heavy. The flame of a candle bends in the wind. A photograph catches a little light and then falls back into shadow. Someone says Lauria's name. Someone says Ashley's. The silence afterward is not empty. It is filled with all the years that have passed since the birthday sleepover at the Freeman home. When you return from that imagined gathering to the file, the paper feels different. The reports become less abstract because you have placed them beside living grief. A search log is not just a search log. It is a day when a family waited. A court date is not just a proceeding. It is a morning when people dressed carefully, drove to a courthouse, and tried to prepare for whatever might be said. The legal pages in the Freeman case carry that quiet tension. They speak of charges, pleas, sentences, and obligations. The language is formal, sometimes distant, yet behind the formal wording is the central human request. Tell us where they are. You can almost see that request written invisibly between the lines, more important than any legal phrase and harder to satisfy. Busick's position in the later case made him the person many hoped would answer that request, but hope placed on a defendant is uncertain by nature. A defendant may have motives to cooperate, but also motives to protect himself, shift blame, or minimize. You read his role carefully, neither granting him more knowledge than the evidence shows, nor forgetting that he may have held knowledge the families desperately needed. This careful reading matters because cold cases can attract simple stories. One person did everything. One confession explains all. One search will solve it. But the Freeman case resisted simple shapes. It involved multiple named suspects, a damaged first scene, long-delayed witness accounts, public rumor, legal compromise, and the unresolved location of Ashley and Lauria. You can only approach it slowly. Slow approach is not weakness. It is the only honest way to handle a case like this. Each claim has to be set on the table. Each source has to be weighed. Each emotional reaction has to be acknowledged, then placed gently to one side, while the facts are checked. You may feel compassion deeply, but compassion does not ask you to abandon care with evidence. The investigators who returned to the case in later years had to live with that tension. They wanted to help the families. They wanted accountability. They wanted recovery. They also had to build something that would hold in court and in the field. You can imagine the pressure of that, the late meetings, the careful wording, the silence after someone says, "We still do not have enough for that." Not enough is another phrase that has marked many cold cases. It can mean not enough to search safely, not enough to charge, not enough to identify a location, not enough to prove a claim. The phrase sounds flat, but inside it are hours of work and a deep reluctance to disappoint. You can hear a detective choosing the words carefully when speaking to a family. For a family, not enough may feel unbearable. They may have enough to believe, enough to grieve, enough to know that someone is withholding something. But the system requires another kind of enough. And the difference can feel like a wall. In the Freeman case, that wall stood for years between suspicion and formal action, between old rumors and charges. When formal action finally came, it did not erase the wall completely. It opened a passage through part of it. The charges and plea created a legal record that named responsibility, but the passage did not lead all the way to recovery. You can feel how the families might stand in that partial opening, grateful for movement and still aching for the answer beyond it. Partial answers require a different kind of emotional strength. A person must accept what has been gained without pretending it is all that was needed. You can see that in this case. There was movement after years. There was a defendant. There was a sentence. But Ashley and Loria were not brought home by that process, and so the central waiting continued. The public sometimes struggles with partial answers. It wants categories, solved or unsolved, open or closed, justice or no justice. Real cases often sit between those words. The Freeman case, especially after the plea, occupied that in-between space. You, reading quietly, let the in-between remain visible. It is more faithful to the truth than a cleaner label would be. In that in-between space, investigative work can continue even after a court outcome. A file may be legally changed and still practically open in important ways. Searches can be planned. Tips can be checked. Information can still come in. The families can still ask. You can feel the case breathing there, not with urgency, but with a slow, persistent need. The need often returns to physical recovery. In missing person cases, recovery is not just evidence, it is care. It allows families to mark a place, hold a service, and stop imagining every possible landscape. It gives the missing person back a certain dignity that uncertainty has withheld. That is why the searches in the Freeman case matter so much. Even after legal accountability entered the record, you can imagine a family member looking across a search area, not knowing whether hope should rise or protect itself. The horizon may be low and pale. The wind moves through dry grass. Searchers speak in careful voices. There is a strange politeness around such work, because everyone understands the stakes, and no one wants to say too much before the ground has answered. Ground answers slowly, if at all. Sometimes a dog alerts and nothing is found. Sometimes equipment suggests an anomaly that turns out to be old debris. Sometimes a promising place yields only rocks, roots, and rusted metal. The searchers document it. The family absorbs it. The file grows by a few pages, and the question remains. You sit with that repetition until it becomes part of the rhythm of the case. Tip, search, wait. Statement, map, wait. Hearing, plea, wait. The pattern is not dramatic, but it is real. It is the sound of patient detective work across years, where progress may not feel like progress until much later, and even then may not be enough. The old photographs of Ashley and Loria give the pattern its human center. You can imagine one pinned near a desk where investigators worked, not as decoration, but as orientation. A young face in a photograph can change the feeling of an office. It reminds everyone that the file is not a puzzle for its own sake. It is a promise still owed. That promise may be why some retired investigators continue to answer questions about old cases. They no longer hold the badge in the same way, but they hold memory. They remember the smell of the scene, the first calls, the early theories, and the family's faces. In the Freeman case, such memories would have been valuable and complicated because early events were themselves part of later scrutiny. A retired officer's memory can help, but it must also be checked against records. Time softens even professional recollection. A person may remember the emotional truth of a day more clearly than the sequence of actions. You can respect their service and still compare their words to reports, photographs, and timelines. Again, the work asks for both kindness and rigor. Rigor can feel almost tender when applied for the sake of the missing. A correctly dated note matters, because Ashley and Loria matter. A properly documented search matters because their families deserve confidence in what was done. A careful interview matters because false certainty could steal more years. The discipline is not cold at its root. It is a form of respect. In the Freeman case, respect also means naming Danny and Kathy Freeman with care. They were not only part of the scene, they were Ashley's parents, people whose lives had their own histories, stresses, griefs, and relationships. Their deaths began the official investigation, and their home became the first place everyone had to understand. You read their names gently too. Danny and Kathy had already lived through the death of their son Shane before the fire. That earlier loss shaped public understanding of the family and the tensions around them. You do not need to enter that history loudly. You simply acknowledge that grief had already visited the Freeman family, and that investigators had to work in a community where that prior grief was known. Community context matters, but it can also mislead. Because Danny had been angry over Shane's death and had clashed with law enforcement, some early thinking moved toward him when he was not found. Later, when his remains were discovered in the home, that thinking had to shift. You can feel how a context that seemed useful in 1 hour became inadequate in the next. That is why investigators are trained, at their best, to let new facts change old assumptions. The file should be a living document, not a monument to the first theory. In the Freeman case, the need to change course was obvious and painful. You turn those pages with the humility of someone watching an early error become part of a decades-long story. Early error can create a second investigation alongside the first. Investigators are not only asking what happened to the victims, they are also asking what happened to the investigation itself. What was seen? What was missed? Who decided what? Which reports were made? Which assumptions shaped action? You can feel the file folding back on itself, examining its own beginnings. That self-examination is necessary. It may be uncomfortable for agencies, but it serves the truth. Families deserve honesty about mistakes. Future investigators need to know where the record is thin. Public trust requires more than confidence. It requires accountability when confidence was not earned. The case becomes stronger when its weaknesses are named plainly. Yet naming weakness does not mean abandoning the work. If anything, it deepens the obligation to continue carefully. The missed discovery of Danny Freeman could not be undone, but later investigators could still search, interview, prosecute, and document. The first chapter was damaged. The later chapters still had to be written as faithfully as possible. You, as the quiet detective tonight, can hold that damaged beginning without letting it become the whole story. The file contains mistakes, but it also contains persistence. It contains rumors, but also testimony. It contains failed searches, but also continued searching. It contains court action, but also unanswered need. The case is not one thing. It is many things, layered over years. Those layers can feel almost geological. The fire scene is the deepest layer, dark and altered. Above it sit early statements, searches, theories, family advocacy, media attention, renewed interviews, charges, plea proceedings, and further searches. Each layer presses on the one beneath it. To understand the Freeman case, you do not scrape them away quickly. You brush them slowly, like an archivist protecting brittle paper. The archivist image suits the families as much as the detectives. Families in long cases often preserve items no one else knows how to value. A newspaper clipping with a small error, a note from an officer, a photo from a vigil, a list of names called years before. These items may never enter court, but they form the emotional archive of the case. You can imagine opening a family binder and feeling the plastic sleeves catch slightly under your fingers. Inside, each page is a year, a lead, a search, a remembrance. The binder has weight. It may smell faintly of paper, home, and time. It is not official evidence, but it is evidence of effort, and effort matters in a case that might otherwise be reduced to its unsolved parts. The official archive has its own atmosphere. Box numbers, labels, chain of custody forms, discs, photographs, and reports. The room may be cooler than expected, with a dry air that preserves paper but makes your hands feel rough. You pull the Freeman case materials carefully, knowing that each object has outlasted the moment that created it. The past is present here, but only in fragments. Fragments require patience because they rarely announce their importance. A small note may identify a person who later becomes relevant. A map mark may explain why a property was searched. A date in a margin may correct a public timeline. You learn to read slowly, not because you expect every line to matter, but because you cannot know in advance which line will. That careful reading is part of what makes cold case investigation feel like a vocation. It rewards attention more than speed. It asks for a person willing to be bored without becoming careless, moved without becoming unsteady, skeptical without becoming cynical. You can feel those qualities gathering as you sit with the file, page after page, night after night. The Freeman case, because it stretched so long, also shows how investigative cultures change. What seemed acceptable in one era may be questioned in another. Documentation standards improve. Missing person protocols evolve. Public expectations shift. Technology changes what people believe should be possible. Later investigators inherit not only a case, but a changed understanding of how cases should be handled. That change can be useful, but it can also create frustration. People looking back may ask why something was not done that later became standard. Sometimes the answer is failure. Sometimes it is limited resources. Sometimes the tool did not exist. Sometimes the importance of a detail was not yet clear. You weigh those possibilities without rushing, because fairness to the past and accountability for the past both matter. In 1999, the digital world was far quieter than it is now. There were no widespread smartphone records, no constant social media traces, no doorbell cameras on every block. Investigators depended more heavily on direct observation, phone records of a different kind, paper files, and people willing to talk. You can feel that older investigative world in the texture of the case. The lack of digital traces gave witness accounts even greater importance. Where someone was seen, what someone said, which vehicle passed, who had access to a place, and who seemed afraid could all become central. But human accounts are fragile. They need corroboration. They change under pressure. They can be distorted by rumor. The case therefore required patient human work and patient skepticism together. Today, a similar case might produce more immediate data, but data is not the same as understanding. The Freeman case reminds us that even with modern tools, investigators still need careful listening, community trust, and humility before uncertainty. Technology can illuminate a path, but someone must still walk it, ask questions, and decide what the light is actually showing. As the public conversation about old cases expanded over the years, Ashley and Lauria's names reached people far beyond Welch. Podcasts, television segments, articles, and online forums brought renewed attention. That attention could be helpful, but it also risked turning the case into content detached from the families. A calm retelling must resist that risk by keeping care at the center. Care means avoiding the sharp edges of speculation when they do not help. It means not lingering on disturbing claims for their own sake. It means remembering that every person in the file was real, including those who made mistakes, those who were accused, those who waited, and those who searched. The tone stays low because the subject deserves steadiness. You can feel the difference between steadiness and detachment. Detachment turns away from pain. Steadiness sits near it without exploiting it. In the Freeman case, steadiness lets us say that 2 girls disappeared, that 2 adults were killed, that investigators made errors, that suspects were later named, that 1 man was sentenced, and that the search for the girls continued, all without raising our voice. That low voice is appropriate for bedtime, but it is also appropriate for old grief. Loudness can make a story feel smaller by forcing it into performance. Quiet allows the facts to breathe. You can hear the soft space around each name, each date, each road. The file does not need to shout to be understood. It needs someone to stay with it. Staying with it means returning once more to the family's long advocacy. Lauria's parents were publicly persistent, and Ashley's loved ones also carried the loss of a whole household shattered in one night. The case belonged to both families, though their grief took different forms. You can imagine how hard it would be to share a public story when the private losses are not identical but deeply intertwined. Ashley lost her parents as well as her own future. Loria was taken from another home into that tragedy because she was a friend spending the night. Their stories meet in the Freeman house, but they do not become the same story. A careful investigator remembers the distinctness of each life. A careful narrator does too. The friendship between the girls is one of the quietest details in the case. A sleepover suggests trust, ease, and ordinary teenage closeness. It suggests someone being welcomed into a home. When the investigation names both girls together, it also preserves that bond. You can think of them not only as two missing persons, but as two friends whose last known night began in the familiar comfort of companionship. Friendship matters, because it keeps the beginning human. Before the fire, before the search grids, before the court documents, there was an invitation and a visit. There was a birthday. There were the ordinary sounds of a home at night. Maybe a television, a conversation, footsteps, the hum of a refrigerator. The investigation begins after those sounds are gone, but the listener should remember they existed. In cold case work, reconstructing ordinary context can be as important as reconstructing extraordinary events. What was expected? Who should have been there? What belongings should have moved if someone left voluntarily? What plans were made? What would have been normal for Ashley and Loria? These questions help investigators distinguish a planned absence from an unexplained one. The answers in the Freeman case pointed toward concern from the beginning. The girls were gone from a burned home where Ashley's parents were found dead. Their belongings and circumstances did not suggest a simple decision to leave. You can feel the early urgency beneath the later calm, because even when we retell the case softly, we understand that those first hours mattered profoundly. The first hours in missing person cases are often described as critical. In this case, they were also confused. The scene was damaged. Danny was initially unaccounted for. The assumption around him diverted attention. The girl's absence had to be understood within a shifting fact pattern. You read those early pages knowing how much they held and how much they failed to hold. A detective at the time may have stood near the remains of the home, smoke still in the air, trying to fit the visible facts into a workable theory. That is the human reality of investigation. People must act before they know everything. They must choose where to search, whom to question, what to tell the public. Later, those choices can be judged by what became known, and sometimes they should be. The file allows us to judge and understand at the same time. You can say the early handling caused harm. You can also see how uncertainty shaped action. A mature reading does not require one feeling only. It allows regret, accountability, and continued effort to sit together, much as they did in the long life of the case itself. As the years passed, the case became a kind of test of whether continued effort could overcome a poor beginning. In some ways it did. Investigators eventually brought a case against Busick, witnesses spoke, legal responsibility was assigned. In other ways, the poor beginning and the long silence kept taking their toll. Because Ashley and Loria were not found, that mixed result is important. It prevents the story from becoming either hopeless or triumphant. The Freeman case is neither. It is a record of harm, error, persistence, partial accountability, and continued absence. You sit with that mixture because it is more truthful than a neat emotional category. Real cold cases often live there, in the grey space between achievement and sorrow. The grey space has its own quiet atmosphere. It is the color of winter roads, old photographs, courthouse hallways, and ash cooled by morning air. It is also the color of paper that has been handled for years. You can see it in the file, not as gloom, but as age. The case has weathered, and everyone who touched it has weathered with it. Weathering changes people. Families may become skilled at public language. Detectives may become more patient. Communities may become wary of old certainties. Witnesses may become ready. The case itself may not change in its central facts, but the people around it do. Cold casework depends on noticing those changes and understanding when they create an opening. An opening might be small. A person who once refused an interview agrees to talk. A former relationship ends, making someone less afraid. A new prosecutor reviews an old suspect. A retired officer finds a note. A family member shares a document that had not been in the official file. You can feel how each small opening requires someone to be ready to receive it. Readiness is a quiet skill. An investigator must have the file organized enough to recognize significance when a new detail appears. If the file is chaotic, a useful tip may sink into it unnoticed. If the investigator lacks context, a name may seem new when it was actually central years before. Organization becomes part of justice, as plain and practical as a labeled folder. In the Freeman case, organization must have been especially challenging because the case carried so much public and private material, multiple agencies, many years, numerous rumors, and shifting suspect theories create a dense record. You can imagine sorting it into binders, digital folders, timelines, and witness charts. The work is slow, but it gives the investigation a mind it can return to. A timeline is one of the most calming and unforgiving tools in such work. It places events in order, it shows gaps, it reveals overlaps. It refuses to let a claim float without time attached. You can run your finger down the line: birthday, sleepover, fire, discovery, search, rumor, statement, renewed interview, arrest, plea. The line is simple, but what it holds is not. Gaps in a timeline are not empty. They are marked places of inquiry. Where were the girls during this interval? Who saw the suspects during that one? When did a witness first hear a claim? How long passed before it was reported? You learn to respect gaps because they tell you where the file is honest enough to admit it does not know. Honest gaps are better than false bridges. A false bridge may comfort the public briefly, but it cannot carry a case. The Freeman investigation had to avoid building bridges from rumor alone. It needed testimony, corroboration, and legal sufficiency. That is why the process took so long, and why even the later outcome remained incomplete. Incomplete does not mean meaningless. That is another distinction worth holding. The arrest and plea mattered. The searches mattered. The family advocacy mattered. The corrected understanding of the early scene mattered. Each effort added something, even if none supplied everything. You can think of the case as a long table where each person places one small item, hoping the whole arrangement will eventually show the way. Tonight, as you sit at that table, the room is quiet enough to hear the old paper breathe. The lamp warms the edge of the file. The map lies open. The names remain visible: Ashley Freeman, Loria Bible, Danny and Kathy Freeman, Lorene and Jay Bible, Ronnie Busick, Warren Philip Welch, David Pennington. Each name belongs to a different role, and each role must be kept clear. Clarity is a kindness in a case crowded with pain. It helps us avoid turning everyone into symbols. The victims were people. The families were people. The suspects were people too, accountable or alleged according to their place in the record. The investigators were people, capable of care and error. The witnesses were people, with fear, memory, and sometimes silence. The file is human all the way through, because it is human. It is imperfect. Paper can be lost. Memory can bend. Agencies can miscommunicate. Families can be hurt by the very systems meant to help them. Witnesses can wait too long. Suspects can die before trial. Courts can resolve only part of what grief demands. The Freeman case carries all of that, and still the work continues. So you can set the file down gently now, knowing where the record stands. The murders of Danny and Kathy Freeman led to a conviction, but not a full answer. Ronnie Busick pleaded guilty as an accessory, while Warren Philip Welch and David Pennington were already dead before they could face a courtroom, and Loria Bible and Ashley Freeman have never been found. Their disappearance remains unsolved in the deepest sense because no one has brought them home, and the case remains open to this day. That is the quiet ache at the center of it, the part that no sentence can soften completely. A court can name responsibility in one narrow way, and investigators can follow testimony, searches, maps, rumors, and old fear as far as they will go, but a family still waits for the simple mercy of knowing where their child rests. You can feel how small the word closure becomes beside that kind of waiting. It is not a door that swings shut. It is more like a light left on through the night, not because anyone believes the night will hurry, but because love does not know how to do otherwise. And so the story does not end with certainty. It ends with care. It ends with the names held plainly, without decoration and without forgetting. Danny Freeman, Kathy Freeman, Ashley Freeman, Loria Bible. It ends with the people who searched fields and mines and cellars, who answered phones, who kept boxes of documents, who listened again to old statements, who refused to let silence become the final authority. As you drift away from the hard edges of this case, you do not have to solve what the years have not solved. You only have to remember that behind every cold file, there are warm lives, once ordinary and bright, and people who still speak their names into the present. The unanswered things can rest here for tonight, not erased, not explained away, but held with patience. And somewhere beyond the record, beyond the ash and paper and passing years, may Loria and Ashley be at peace.